I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, these guys got it. And they totally understood the issue, right?
It's unbelievable when you read some of these quotes from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I mean, these are the gentlemen that set up the beautiful system that America came and put us at the top of the world. So, I don't think we should ignore their views casually.
Bankers can create money via credit, ex nihilo, out of nothing.
Out of nothing. Fact. I mean, that's why we have these credit booms and credit busts. Bankers sat there and they said to themselves, we've got a pretty good game going here. When we have a boom, we make a lot of money. We make all kinds of loans. We get paid interest. Everything's great. The problem is that everything gets overextended. The economy gets way out over its skis. Malinvestments get made. Bad ideas get pursued and they fail. And then suddenly all these loans we've made, some of them are going to go bad.
Yeah.
And if enough of them go bad, we're going to go bankrupt. We don't like that. That's a really bad deal. You know what? We need to set up a system where the federal government will back us when that happens. Voila. Out comes the Federal Reserve. And when the bankers know it's heads I win, tails you lose, hey, I'm going to take every good borrower I can.
Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws.
Right, Meyer, Rothschild.
The Rothschilds, yes.
And most people don't understand this. And I think this is what Henry Ford said. If everyone understood how it worked, we'd have a revolution.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunked. I'm joined here today by my friend Larry Lepard, and we are going to discuss the fourth episode in our series on his book, The Big Print. Today, we're going to talk about the path to pure fiat. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Nice to be back with you, Maddie, enjoying that.
So, fiat money is something that has been tried throughout history many times. I know yesterday we touched on it a little bit. I told you the story about Marco Polo. I found one of his quotes when he went to the Genghis Khan and he was traveling the Silk Road, and he found out that they were using the bark of trees as money. He said, "You might say that Kublai has the secret of alchemy in perfection. Mm-hmm. The Khan causes every year to be made such a vast quantity of this money, which costs him nothing, that it must equal in amount all the treasure of the world." So,
yeah, it's fiat has been tried for a long, long time. This is not a new problem.
You've got some quotes here in your book where you talk about Lord Acton, who's responsible for that very famous quote, "Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely."
Yeah.
But even hundreds of years ago, the same issues in society and problems and discussions and debates that we seem to be having now reverberate over the centuries, right? So he says, "The issue which has swept down the centuries and which will have to be fought sooner or later is the people versus the banks."
Yeah.
How familiar does that sound?
Sounds completely familiar, and it's what we're fighting through right now.
Our producer here, his favorite quote is, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws."
Right, Meyer, Rothschild.
The Rothschilds, yes. Mayor Rothschild. Why don't we start off talking a little bit about the Coinage Act of 1792? And I wanted to pick your brain on why the government at the time used silver as opposed to gold, and kind of, the two precious metals, like what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, as you know, the Constitution specified only silver and gold could be money, and then they wanted to set some standards, and so they realized that all kinds of other coins were being used. There was a Spanish thing called a pieces of 8, Spanish silver coin that could be divided into 8 quarters, and so what they did was they defined the dollar and the silver in terms of grams of gold or silver, and they set a ratio between the two. And they said, this is what is going to be currency in our country today on a go-forward basis. And they just did that because those were the two soundest monies. And the difference between gold and silver, I mean, and it carries down to this day, is gold's not a great transactional medium. I mean, it's so valuable in such small amounts that even a small gold coin is more than, you're going to buy coffee, as an example, you're not going to use gold.
You have to almost flake, you take a little flake of it.
It's just impractical.
Yeah.
And silver, since the ratio in the Earth's crust is roughly 16-1, silver is much more plentiful. And so silver became kind of everyday money, and gold became big asset transactional money. So maybe if you're making a huge purchase, you'd pay for it in gold. But if you're buying coffee or tobacco or whatever it is that people were buying back then, they would use silver coins. And And this actually reflected, too, what was going on in Rome way back in the day. There wasn't enough gold for gold to be the everyday currency, but there was enough silver. And so the silver denarius was what was used in transactions. So that's really the difference between the two.
It's important to note for our listeners, too, that, as a characteristic of money, divisibility is an important characteristic.
Absolutely.
And gold is sadly lacking in that characteristic because it's very hard to use and divide to transact with. It's why this idea of paper notes issued off of gold was even a thing to begin with.
Correct.
Gold was lacking in that characteristic of money, where fiat currency has it's better with divisibility, right?
Correct.
It has that better characteristic of money. Obviously, we know it's not scarce at all, and when those claims slowly devolve over the years, you end up with pure fiat hell. But
exactly,
which we're going to unpack today.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right.
We also talked a little bit about this quote by author G. Edward Griffin, which is a law which, talked about fraudulently, anyone who debased or fraudulently altered the nation's coinage would suffer the death penalty. And he said, a law which, if enforced today, would wipe out the House of Representatives, the Senate, the managerial level of the Treasury Department, and the presidency as well.
Exactly.
Another famous individual, right? Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton was pro having a central bank, but Thomas Jefferson essentially said, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs.
That's correct.
I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, these guys got it. I mean, they totally understood the issue, right?
It's unbelievable when you read some of these quotes from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I mean, and these are the gentlemen that set up the beautiful system that America became and put us at the top of the world. So, I don't think we should ignore their views casually, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they were considered views, and they created this great country.
What are your thoughts on the War of 1812? It seems like war is always kind of goes hands in hand.
Yeah, well, so this was kind of the first example of, the problems associated with fiat currency, right? I mean, the war was expensive. They had a hard time financing it. They used the banks. The banks helped them to finance it in terms of making loans to the government. And the banks became over-levered in the process. And so they had to suspend specie convertibility. And let me define what that is. Gold and silver are sometimes referred to as specie. And in classical banking, the rule was you would deposit your gold and silver to a bank. They'd give you a banknote or they'd give you currency. But at any point in time, you could come back and say, here's the currency, please give me back my gold. And this is how one knew that your currency was sound, because you had exchangeability into gold. When this war took place, they had a lot of expenses. They ran deficits. The bank helped them to finance the deficits. And then, of course, what happened is people realized, this bank has just printed money, printed obligations and debt that are not backed by specie. And so we'd like to have our specie back because we don't trust you, Mr. Banker. and Mr. Banker had this is the first notable time when the bank, what I call the bank get out of jail free card was used, where they kind of said, oh, no, sorry, we're suspending specie convertibility. You can't do that. You've got to hold the notes. Well, guess what happened? The value of the notes decreased in gold and silver terms on a go-forward basis. But more importantly, this set a precedent that was used multiple times during the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So before the Fed existed, the get out of jail free card for a bank that got overextended and printed too much paper currency was, sorry, we're shutting the window. You can't come get your gold back. Mm-hmm. And then usually it was followed by a devaluation, or such that, okay, you can get your paper gold back, or you can get, we'll exchange your paper for gold. It'll be a percentage of it. I mean, let me give you an example, we're going to get to this, but as an example, in the Civil War, Lincoln passed a law, and they issued greenbacks, which were just a general obligation of the federal government. They were not formally backed by silver and gold. Everybody knew that. And what, of course, happened is immediately greenbacks started trading at a discount to silver and gold. So if somebody say, well, are you going to pay me in silver or gold? Or are you going to pay me in greenbacks? Great. I know that greenback says it's worth $1, but mm-hmm. by the end of the war, they were only worth 30 or 40 cents on the dollar.
Murray Rothbard said that this was one of the most flagrant violations of property rights in American history.
Yeah.
What other option do you think they could have done with the War of 1812? What you just said, just kind of say, hey, we're closing up. You can't redeem it, and then we're going to just.
I'm not really sure. And to be fair, and to not be critical of them, I mean, it's kind of good that we won that war, and they kind of closed the chapter on the battle with the British. And I'm not entirely sure. I mean, they could have said we're going to tax you, and we need to tax you. It's an existential war.
Yeah,
that would have been more honest than depreciating the currency. But let's face it, wars are expensive. And by the way, some wars need to be fought. I mean, I think World War II needed to be fought, right? And we did it through, effectively QE because they monetized all that debt for a period of time through a yield curve control.
I'm going to read another quote by Andrew Jackson. It's crazy how many famous founding fathers have quotes in this book.
Yeah.
It's like a crash course in history of the founding of America. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you. And when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. I have determined to rout you out, and by the eternal, I will rout you out.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson are my two favorite presidents. I mean, Andrew Jackson was the 7th president of the United States. He prevented the Second Bank of the United States from being rechartered, and he totally got it, right? I mean, the Little who was running the bank was corrupt as all get out, and this is the heart of what we see today. The bankers have set up a system where it's heads they win, tails we lose.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what he said.
Right. I mean, they get to gamble. They gamble like crazy. They make a ton of money when it's going well. When it doesn't go well, they come and they charge. They come and they charge the taxpayer, and they dilute the currency, and we all pay in terms of inflation.
Yeah.
So that they win both ways.
What they roam, like, I think there's this famous musical that's out called Hamilton. Have you heard of that?
Oh yeah, I saw it. It was a wonderful show.
Yeah. It's like they almost romanticize this idea of the other side of the coin, right? Like of Hamilton versus Andrew Jackson and kind of this whole thing. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, look, if you're a statist, you think that Hamilton was a great guy because he believed in the power of the state. He tended to be an Anglophile. He was sympathetic to the British establishing of a central bank in 1689. And there are those who obviously felt differently. I mean, the country, there are a lot of threads that formed this country. I mean, there was the kind of the Cavalier thread that, came into the South and established that whole system. And then there was the much more libertarian, Scottish thread that came in and populated Appalachia. And, they were descendants of the people who fought, on behalf of William Wallace up in Scotland. So, the libertarian thread, was very sympathetic to the Jacksonian, way of being. I mean, he was from Tennessee. He was part of that whole Scottish crew. And, the more cavalier, royalist, I would say, almost thread was what spawned somebody like a Hamilton. I mean, he grew up in Bermuda, but, these two threads have been competing for quite some time, right? And one believes more in centralized power and the power of government. They tend to be statists. And, the rebels that populated the Appalachian and then certain parts of the South, they're kind of like, hey, your government, you can take it and shove it, and your monetary system, we don't believe in all that. We want fair, so there are these two threads.
So from 1833 until the Civil War, the American banking system operated through a decentralized network of state-chartered banks. What do you think about that era? Do you think it didn't work particularly well? I mean, it was rough. It was kind of a cowboy, era. A lot of banks failed. You didn't know what banks worked. There were all kinds of banks issuing banknotes. I mean, one could make an argument that they did need to rationalize the banking system, rationalize the currency system, et cetera. But one thing is true, that throughout that era, gold and silver were still money, very clearly. And so, I think there were a lot of people who didn't trust banks, and they dealt in gold and silver, and so that was always your salvage, case as a person operating in that environment.
But yes, I mean, there were some who did it better than others. There was a system up in Boston called the Suffolk system where they actually determined that banks, I mean, look, these banks weren't stupid, and they all recognized that the risk of a run, they got too over leveraged. There was a risk of a bank run. And the Suffolk system was one in Boston where they said, well, you've got to keep 40% of your balances of the debt you have outstanding, your note balances in specie, in gold. And of course, that system worked, and they did not have runs. But yeah, there were a ton of wildcat bankings and wildcat banks, and there were a lot of cases where people would put their money in the bank and they'd lose all of it. And one thing that is interesting that's different back then is the laws were written back then so that if you were a banker and you lost somebody's money, your bank went bankrupt and you lost somebody's money, you were actually personally responsible. Really? Yeah. And now I don't know how much that was enforced, but you were. Even up until the Depression, that was somewhat true, and those laws got amended as well to protect the bankers so that they weren't personally liable. But think about it, if you're a bank and you're personally liable for the losses of your customers, you're going to behave in a more responsible way. Of course, no doubt about it. Yeah. It's crazy that is not still the case. Yeah, you would think, right? Yeah. Again, the laws have worked to water down, the responsibility and to centralize power. And this centralization of power, and that's when we're talking about the future, the decentralization of Bitcoin and what we're seeing in the world with the internet. It's what's so beautiful about all this, because decentralization means that you're going to know the people across the table, and there's not going to be some centralized power just dictating to you how life is going to be. I think the most beautiful part about Bitcoin is that it is the species itself. So there's no it's true. What's the word I'm looking for? When you hold something, it's true bare asset. You don't have to worry about any intermediary. I mean, it's a little hard because there's no physical presence of it. But if you have those digital bare asset, if you have those coin keys, that's it. You've got it, and that's all there is to it. Yeah. But it is interesting to see how the United States evolved over time, which takes us to the Civil War, the Legal Tender Act of 1862. Yeah. The greenback. Yeah, that's what I described earlier. I mean, Lincoln, again, we got a war. It's really expensive. How the hell are we going to finance this thing? We don't have enough tariff revenue. We don't have enough income tax to pay for it. And so he and his Treasury Secretary, Simon Chase, figured it out that, okay, there's a way to do this, and we're going to issue a general obligation, which, I suppose in theory could have been challenged in the courts. It might have been. The one thing the book's a little bit weak on, I'm not a lawyer, and I haven't, there are people who've done a fantastic job of documenting all of the legal changes along the way that kind of made all this possible. Do you know what I mean? I mean, a lot of these things, if you just strictly interpret the Constitution, one would say, how the hell did they do this? This is everything that's happening today even. How the hell did they do this? I mean, the Constitution says only gold and silver can be money. Well, really? Lincoln said greenbacks are money. So that's not constitutional, right? Well, yeah, I think it got challenged, and of course, the courts supported him. So, it's a case of... there was just a continual, the chapter is the path to pure fiat. And what we see, what I think is interesting about it, as you look at it in a historical context, it's just this kind of continual erosion. Yeah. It's just and each little step may not have seemed like much, but they cumulatively keep building up. But 300 years later, you've got all these little, death by 1,000. That's exactly right. Yeah. Okay, so Lincoln can create greenbacks. All right, well, that's a data point. I think there was... Yeah, I think when they established I want to say, I think it was the Federal Reserve, or was it when Nixon closed the gold window? There's these court cases kind of about it, and reading some of the dissents are just incredibly interesting. If you read some of the dissents, sure. Some of them were really predicted and kind of said, this isn't going to end well. This is not going to end well, and they're right. They're right. Yeah, very very interesting, right? So I'm sure there's something very similar with what we're reading here. But I mean, even stuff like the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, like, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And then you go to these states and you've got these activist judges saying, the Second Amendment doesn't exist in my courtroom. Meanwhile, the same judge had to put their hand and swear to uphold the Constitution. It's like, how do you can't even rectify this? I mean, this person should instantly be there were so many things that happened over time. I mean, all these implied powers that got granted to the government that were never there. I mean, the founding fathers never envisioned them, but they, they became quote unquote implied. It's nuts. There's this concept of enumerated rights. Have you heard of that? Yeah. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. Paul, why don't you pull that up and define it if you can? That's an interesting topic, a little rabbit hole to go down. One of my favorite cypherpunks
which I mentioned the other day with his book or his essay Shelling Out. He's got a blog called Enumerated. So,
oh, interesting.
Yeah, it kind of talks about that. He's got a lot of great essays and writings about a lot of this stuff, but it's fascinating rabbit holes to go down. So yeah, it's unenumerated. So enumerated is...
That's what's written down.
That's what's written down.
Specifically in the Constitution.
Yeah, specifically in the Constitution. So it does all
unenumerated are all the implied things.
Exactly, yeah.
That they,
which are not explicitly written, but may be inferred or recognized through interpretation, such as the right to privacy.
Right, and that's actually a good one that was implied. But actually the Fourth Amendment had that search and seizure. But there was a court. I'm not a lawyer, but there was a court decision. What was the court? Can you Google what was the court decision that gave the government expanded powers above and beyond what was originally written in the Constitution? It was a landmark decision. It was like in the early 1800s. I think it might have been like Plessy versus Ferguson. McCulloch versus Maryland. Yeah. Go up a little bit. Read it. This court decision, most of us have for granting the federal government expanded powers beyond those explicitly written in the Constitution. Yeah. Applied powers. That was a big, bad decision.
Yeah.
That was a really bad decision. Because if you go forward from there, almost everything the government has done that's really not written in the Constitution is based on this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I actually mentioned it at one point in the book. Yeah, so look how it arose. It arose to tax the second bank in the United States, right?
The case arose when Maryland attempted to tax the second bank of the United States, a federally chartered institution. James McCulloch, a bank cashier, refused to pay the tax, arguing that a state could not tax a federal entity. Maryland claimed the federal government lacked the constitutional authority to create a national bank, as such power was not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, and of course what the court decided was no, even though it's not explicitly right.
Wow, unanimous decision 7-0.
Yeah.
Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of the federal government expanding its powers in two critical ways. That's wild. 7-0 decision. So they didn't even have a dissent.
Yeah. And they that's right, the necessary and proper clause. So the constitutional authors had left something in there that, the government had the right to do things that were necessary and proper.
Oh man, that was a huge.
It was a loophole.
That's a bad loophole.
It was a bad loophole that got used. And then it's only gotten used more and more and more and more.
It says, as long as they are necessary to carry out its enumerated powers, regulating commerce, collecting taxes, borrowing money.
Right.
Yikes.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, these things are only as good as the people who are working around them, right? And the document's a document, and it's written in a certain way, and people interpret words differently. Right?
Yeah. That's why I love Bitcoin so much. It's kind of
math is kind of hard to mess with.
It's outside the system, It's like
like there's a ledger. There ain't no doubt about it. Done.
Oh man. It makes me think, right? Because the Confederate fiat currency obviously that failed drastically, right?
Right.
They printed that to same thing with the greenbacks. But it makes me think, what would happen? What would happen if they weren't able to do this? Both sides, if they just weren't able to, without getting the consent of the people.
It's a great thought experiment. Yeah. What
would have changed?
Yeah.
Would these wars even have been able to occur?
Yeah.
Would the people have actually said, yes, take 20% of my wealth to go fight this war?
Right. Or maybe more.
Maybe more. Yeah. 30%, 40%. Just take it.
Yeah.
I don't even think the Civil War would have happened if that was the case.
It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, the contra to what they did.
Could you imagine a Bitcoin standard where hey, Florida, we're going to go fight New York or whatever, it's but we need 50% of all your Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But they just can't take it.
I think that's right.
So good luck.
Yeah,
right?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's in these situations, possession does become 9/10 of the law.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's what really speaks to both of us about something like Bitcoin, a Bitcoin standard.
Yeah.
Let's talk about James A. Garfield. He's another interesting character. I really enjoyed reading your book, Larry. I mean, there's just, so much historical context and listening to great leaders of the past hundreds of years ago. reading their quotes,
right?
It just like it takes you to a different moment in history and time. And
Well, that's the thing. I think that's what's important for people to understand, that this isn't just a bunch of right-wing cranks, as Judy Shelton alluded to, talking about sound money.
Yeah.
There've been politicians and people in this country, serious people, that have held this view for a long, long time.
So James A. Garfield was a sound money leader. He was the 20th president of the United States, and he actually was a brigadier general in the Union Army, which I didn't know.
Yeah.
But Garfield actually opposed Lincoln's issuing of all these greenbacks. He consistently championed the gold standard. He's got some famous quotes here. Any party which commits itself to paper money will go down amid the general disaster, covered with the curses of a ruined people. Whoever controls the volume of money in our country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. When you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate.
Isn't that a stunning quote?
Oh, man.
Isn't that a stunning quote?
Unbelievable.
What did he say? Was it 1881, I think was the date on that? Or
1881, yeah.
Yeah.
This was like 6 months before he was assassinated.
He was assassinated, right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, isn't that stunning? I mean, this guy, his brother and I, he totally got it. I mean, and he spoke about it, right? I mean, it's stunning. And yet, his words were not listened to. We slowly, and by the way, at that time we were on the gold standard. I mean, one interesting point to make, I mean, the greenbacks came in. It took a while to get back to the gold standard. I mean, they had to, because of all the paper that had been printed and all the inflation that had occurred. It wasn't, I think, until 1879 that they were kind of fully back on a gold standard. So there was a period of time where kind of the dollar was not entirely fully backed, and then the greenbacks were kind of slowly but surely inflated away.
It seems like throughout most of American history, when they kind of do this stuff, they've always kind of gone back, which is nice to see. At least
they tried
until
right. I mean, there was
recently.
I mean, fortunately, there was enough sentiment in the country that was important. We had to get back there.
Yeah, it makes me think about how they sort of the past 100 years or so, the past 120 years, essentially, they've very slowly, they established the Fed, and then they kind of reduced the amount of gold, and then they kind of
started off. They were supposed to hold 40% of their balance in gold, and like the Bank of England.
It was like with these periods of war, people still, the same generation realized they understood these lessons of sound money.
Correct.
So they probably demanded that it go back.
Right.
But the way they've done it the past 120 years or so, it's been so insidious. It's one domino, one domino, one domino.
That's exactly right.
You've got, the Great Depression and, banning of holding gold and all these like little steps where they devalue hey, it's worth this amount, the dollar's worth this amount of gold, and then it's worth a little bit less. And then, slowly and slowly and slowly until you get to 1971. And then it's like, what the fuck happened in 1971?
Yeah, right. Like this stuff doesn't even matter anymore. We're modern and we don't need it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. What? Tell me about Garfield's assassination. So it seems like I'm sure there's a lot of
conspiracy about that the unsound money guys were the people who killed him. I haven't read that much about it. I don't really know. I'm sure there are people who've gone down that hole and know a lot about it. But and there are other people who say that Kennedy was killed because he was trying to remonetize silver as but is that true? I don't know. I mean, there are people who say the Titanic was sunk because there were sound money people on the Titanic. I mean, look, all of those things are entirely possible from my point of view. I mean, it's kind of it's fun to talk about it, but it's kind of a pointless debate. We don't know, and we never will know with certainty. Yeah. Right.
It's kind of like those. It's interesting to talk about, but without extraordinary claims, in my mind, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I just haven't.
It's possible. I mean, it's a possibility. All those things are very possible. I don't dispute them, but I can't conclude that they're true. I don't think we know.
What was the National Banking Act of 1863?
Look and see.
I think
I have to remember what I wrote.
So my understanding of it is that there's throughout history, there was a lot more small banks, and then slowly over time, the federal government. I mean, we kind of saw this recently, even with the destruction of Silvergate and all these other banks, and it just seems as time goes on, there's less and less banks, and it's more and more centralized. And
I think that's right. I mean, what it did was it advantaged the New York banks versus all the others. And I'm not a lawyer, and I don't actually even remember. I remember researching this, but I don't remember the specific things that were written in that act. But I do know that the act centralized banking and gave more power to the New York banks versus the state banks. I mean, The state banks were much more distributed. And as I said, some of them did it right, like the Suffolk program up in Massachusetts was doing it right. And again, one can assume that the big and powerful banks were continually lobbying to increase their power and to limit the power of the smaller banks. And so legislation was continually passed that took us in that direction.
The period from I want to say like from 1800 to 1910, I guess. This era, you wrote, the era maintained remarkable price stability and even experienced beneficial deflation as productivity improvements lowered costs. So this is obviously in stark contrast to the whole idea that the Keynesians argue that the economy just can't function without inflation or animal spirits, right? We've got to steal a little bit of money from everybody. We got to steal a little bit of purchasing power to make sure that the economy moves. I think this is referred to as, is this the Gilded Age? I guess was probably.
It was the Gilded Age. The 1870s to 1913 or so. Yeah. And it was very deflationary. And there are other parts of the book where I talk about this. I've got some specific statistics. And the notion that the Keynesians put forth is that you have to have inflation for growth. And of course, inflation creates growth naturally in the top line just because you inflate the money supply, even selling the same number of units, then the sales will be bigger.
It just looks bigger.
It just looks bigger, right? But having said that, this was a deflationary period, and what we saw was there was actual real growth in real incomes of people, and so lifestyles and living standards improved greatly, even though the price level remained relatively stable.
I'm going to read another quote here from Austrian school economist Murray Rothbard, who's one of my favorites. I'm sure he's one of your favorites as well. For they have overlooked the fact that in the natural course of events, when governments and the banking system do not increase the money supply very rapidly, free market capitalism will result in an increase in production and economic growth. Prices will fall, and the consequences will not be depression or stagnation, but prosperity, economic growth, and the spread of the increased living standard to all consumers.
That's right. I mean, deflation is good. And this is what Jeff Booth pointed out in his breakthrough book, The Price of Tomorrow. And that's something, I mean, if you ask anybody at the Federal Reserve, you ask anybody in the banking system, you ask any Keynesian.
You're a heretic.
Yeah, they're going to say, no, we have to have some level of inflation. Otherwise, we risk falling into another Great Depression. That's always the boogeyman, right? And when in fact, deflation is a good thing. I mean, who would not like lower prices? And by the way, we should naturally expect lower prices based on increased productivity. And of course, as I point out in the book, the best example of that is technology. I mean, think of what a computer used to cost, think of what a computer used to do. I mean, it's gotten literally almost millions of times more efficient, in the last 30 years. So
I think the kind of period from 1869 to 1879 really, the Keynesians always use the Great Depression, which is like that one outlier to like argue against this, but then they ignore the Gilded Age and
exactly. Well, they ignore really the entire 19th century. I mean, we started off as a nation of farmers and borderline kind of paupers. I mean, just people scraping out an existence, on this continent, and we ended up with railroads and industrial stuff and ultimately in the early 1900s, electricity and blah blah blah. I mean, it was all. And there was not a lot of inflation during that entire period, and living standards improved enormously. So in a deflationary world, right?
Prices were falling and GDP grew rapidly.
Right.
Rather, deflation is the natural condition of a well-functioning economic system. As productivity and efficiency improve, deflation follows as a natural result of doing more with less.
That's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
That's the goal. We want productivity. If we all want to live better lives, if we want the American dream to continue, we need to operate in a deflationary world, and our kids will have a better life than we have.
Yeah. Can you explain the difference between full reserve banking and fractional reserve banking?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So in the early days, or originally, full reserve banking is where you go and you deposit your gold in a bank and they hold it for you. And it doesn't go anywhere, and you can come back and you can take it out at any time. And the risk of losing that gold is zero, unless the banker's corrupt, because they haven't loaned against it. So they're really, and you might even have to pay them to store your gold.
Yeah.
But and they might give you a checking account, and you can write checks against the gold, and they'll reduce your pro rata piece of the gold. But That's full reserve banking. That's not what we have today. Fractional reserve banking, and this actually started with the goldsmiths even before the founding of the United States, was that goldsmiths were people who would store gold for people in Europe. And people would put gold there on deposit, and then maybe they'd get a letter of credit or have a note against it, and they'd transact in those notes. Because as we talked about earlier, it's hard to walk around with a bunch of gold coins and to spend them. And so what these goldsmiths came to realize was that they could make more commitments against the gold they held than they actually held in terms of gold. And this is called a fractional reserve. So they might say, you might put your gold in their hands, and they'll say, okay, that's worth $1,000, and we'll give you $1,000 account here. You can draw against that to buy things. But then another person might come along and say, I'm not going to deposit any gold, but I want to draw a loan against you guys. You're a bank. So why don't you loan me $1,000 and put $1,000 in my account, and I will pay you interest on that loan. Okay, and so now they have an asset, which is the loan, and they have a liability, which is $1,000 they put in your account, and they'll pay you interest against. You'll pay them interest against it, and they'll make some extra money, and nobody's the wiser. The problem is that now there's $2,000 worth of claims against $1,000 worth of gold. And so if everybody came to the bank and said, please give me my gold, there wouldn't be enough gold to go around. So that it's leverage, it's fractional leverage that takes place when you loan out more than you have on deposit. And, as we talked about with the Suffolk system, I mean, they said, well, you got to have 40% of the gold on deposit. It kind of worked because not everyone's going to come to the bank at the same time and say, give me all my money, right? That's a bank run. And that, in a full reserve banking system, that can't happen. There couldn't be a bank run.
It's impossible, yeah.
It's impossible. The bank has all the money. All the gold. But in a fractional reserve system, it can happen. And then the question becomes, okay, so how many loans are you going to make? Well, when Lehman was operating, it was like 34-1. I mean, debt to equity. So when your equity slice, when you're loaning 34 times what you've got on deposit, guess what?
You can't even make this shit up.
Yeah, right. If some of the loans go bad, the bank is bankrupt, and that's why Lehman went bankrupt, right? So it's this levering up of the banks, this fractional lending against an underlying asset is where the problem begins.
I think that most people, if you polled them or if you did research on this, probably think that it's full reserve.
Of course they do.
Most people,
nobody understands it.
Nobody really has any clue what's actually happening.
Nobody understands it. That's right.
And it's most people probably would want that too. Like, they want to know, hey, if I put my money, most people are probably okay paying
and we've
like,
dealt with it in two ways. And that's, by the way, that's part of how they got the Federal Reserve through. They said, look, you don't want to ever have a bank fail on you and lose all your money. If we put the Federal Reserve in, that won't happen. And then what followed that, of course, when Roosevelt came along and all the banks did fail in the 30s, even with the Federal Reserve in, okay,
yeah,
Roosevelt came along and said, okay, let's do FDIC, which is Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which
wasn't that the point of the Fed? That was supposed to be the point,
It was supposed to be the point of the Fed, but the Fed failed in its mission in the 30s in terms of protecting the banks because so many of them failed. And that's because they relied on the real bills doctrine. But that's a different story. But the FDIC came along. And of course, the FDIC is a joke because, we have $17 trillion worth of bank deposits in the United States at this point in time. The FDIC balance is somewhat less than $200 billion. So, if the FDIC had to bail out all those banks, they don't have the money to do it.
The FDIC's leveraged, 50-1 or 100-1?
More. More.
It's ridiculous.
But again, these are all to create confidence in a system that is a broken system that benefits those at the top. That's the bottom line. That's all you really need to know.
Every dollar deposited remains safely tucked away or invested in highly secure, easily liquidated assets like treasury bills. Need to withdraw your funds? No problem. They're always there, ready and waiting. This system virtually eliminates the threat of bank runs, and there's no mismatch between deposits and available cash. We do not have this system. Thought that was classic, Larry.
Yeah, that's not what we got.
Well, what's funny is that seems to be what all these stablecoin issuers are doing now is like, USDT, USDC is they're kind of doing some version of full reserve banking where, they're buying a little bit of government debt, and that's really, which is extremely liquid, which seems to be, essentially full reserve banking where you can still have some level of profit there from doing something
True,
just like
but
that.
we should point out that the risk of that is that, yes, they're buying government debt. And look, there's no doubt in my mind that government debt won't default because they have a printing press.
Of course, yeah.
But people think, oh well, I've had some people DM me and say, hey, aren't these stable coins okay? I mean, if I put my money there, aren't I safe? Well, yes, nominally.
Of course,
it's still tied to the debt. It's still tied to the dollar. And if we have an event where they have to print a ton of dollars, your real value, and let's just distinguish for the listener the difference between nominal and real. Nominal is the printed amount. It's what this says on the face. Real is inflation adjusted. So, yes, you can have $1,000, but if we double the money supply, that $1,000 will only, so if you have $1,000 bill, they don't exist anymore, but if you had $1,000 bill, that's $1,000 nominally. If we had huge inflation, 50% inflation, and that $1,000 bill would only buy $500 worth of old goods and services, that's $500 real, which is inflation adjusted.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of the financial wizardry they do to just they hope people don't pay attention, and it happens so slowly.
Yeah,
ignore
the man behind the curtain, because the man behind the curtain is the guy who's going to inflate your currency and make your groceries go up, right?
Bankers can create money via credit, ex nihilo.
Yeah,
out of nothing.
Out of nothing.
Thought that was interesting.
It's a fact. I mean, they can. Literally, a bank can be sitting there and they can say, and most people don't understand this, and I think this is what Henry Ford said, if everyone understood how it worked, we'd have a revolution.
Was that Henry Ford or Andrew Jackson?
No, it was Henry Ford who said it, yeah. Most people don't understand that a bank just sitting there, a creditworthy customer can walk into a bank and say, I want to borrow $1,000. And the bank then says, fine, sir, sign this piece of paper. You owe us $1,000. And we'll put $1,000 in your account. Now, the money supply just grew. That $1,000 did not exist until that transaction took place. And so that's fractional reserve banking, growth in credit. And credit is just as good as growth in the money supply, because that guy now has $1,000 worth of purchasing power in his checking account that he can go out and use to buy goods and services. So what you can see is that if the banks do this to the extreme, the money supply grows very, very rapidly. And that's why we have these credit booms and credit busts. And of course, that's what led to the formation of the Fed. These booms and busts that the banks were putting us through, throughout the entire 19th century, the bankers sat there and they said to themselves, we've got a pretty good game going here. When we have a boom, we make a lot of money. We make all kinds of loans. We get paid interest. Everything's great. The problem is that everything gets overextended. The economy gets way out over its skis. Malinvestments get made. Bad ideas get pursued, and they fail. And then suddenly all these loans we've made, some of them are going to go bad.
Yeah.
And if enough of them go bad, we're going to go bankrupt. We don't like that. That's a really bad deal. You know what? We need to set up a system where the federal government will back us when that happens. And voila, out comes the Federal Reserve, right?
This whole this concept of moral hazard, I don't even think we've talked about it yet.
Yeah, we have. That's a great term.
It's really, when you really unpack a lot of this stuff, it's just so obvious. It's so ridiculous. But the important point of what you're essentially saying is that credit creation is the same as money creation, right?
Correct.
And when you've got a Federal Reserve now that's
backing the whole system,
and forcibly keeping interest rates low and just forcing this malinvestment in these loans. And
when the bankers know it's heads I win, tails you lose. Hey, I'm going to take every good lender, every good borrower I can.
So when the money is created, and let me see if I understand this correctly, because these are kind of complicated concepts, and it's a lot of financial wizardry and stuff happening.
Yeah, it's sophisticated.
It's sophisticated fraud. I love that's the way it is. It's sophisticated fraud. And no doubt that there are probably things that get funded, and the Keynesians will argue that yes, there are malinvestments, and yes, there are bad things, but also we've funded businesses and good things happen, and
absolutely
there's that level too. The problem is just
there's no doubt that to some degree having credit and having the ability to having low cost funding does spur innovation.
Yeah,
there's no doubt about that. But you can do that in a sound money system too.
I agree with you completely. That is absolutely true. And the problem is when there's no consequence to making bad business decisions.
Well, that's exactly right.
That's really the issue. And we even see that now with student loans. Why the fuck were these loans even given in the first place if they were to no, this would never really happen if there was actual consequence for giving these loans. Correct. No one's going to give some 19-year-old kid a loan to go study gender ideology and basket weaving for $200,000.
Right.
No actual real private business will do that. The only reason that it's being done is because the government's saying we're going to back this.
Correct.
So of course there's all this fraud and bullshit. Nobody can pay back these loans.
Correct.
It would, if the loan industry had to actually stand on its 2 feet, it would, jobs that actually had high demand in the market that had a high chance of being paid back.
You want to go to trade school and learn how to be an air conditioning tech? We'll loan you money for that because we know that air conditioning techs are needed and they make good money.
100%. Right? Even like a doctor or certain legal things or STEM fields, right? Whatever was actually needed, right?
Yes,
whatever society actually needed, and there was a demand for that, the loan person could look at and say, okay, well, he's going to have a job because boom, boom, boom. I can kind of see this makes sense. I'm going to make some profit out of it. Once he's done with his degree, he's going to be able to pay me back easily because there's high demand for these jobs. None of that occurs. Obviously, it's just total, sleight of hand fraud. It's so insane. But the question I wanted to ask you was, so say I'm a banker and I give a loan and I create this new money that I've given you, right? Obviously inflationary. As you pay that back, essentially when the loan is fully paid back, all of that money now goes away except the interest. So the interest is the new inflation. Is that kind of how this?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's one way of characterizing it. I would say it slightly differently, which is to say that when money gets loaned into existence, it needs to be paid back out of the existing money supply, but there also needs to be interest paid on it. Where's that money going to come from?
That's what I was trying.
Where is that money going to come from? Unless, I mean, and this is why some loans are good, okay? And I actually gave a few examples in the book of this. If the money that's borrowed is then used to increase productivity or earn a profit in excess of the cost of the loan, well, then the interest is covered by the increased benefits and productivity that the society has been provided. See what I'm saying? So it does work. I mean, borrowing to, go back to our example from yesterday where we were talking about the fisherman. He kind of borrowed money. He borrowed food from other people so he could build a boat so he could get more fish. I mean, it works, right? And the people were happy to loan him that money because in the future they all got more fish, right?
No doubt.
And so borrowing, if you're using it in a productive way to create more productivity and to create more outcome output in the society, it's not insane. It makes sense. And then it's all back to proper capital allocation. The problem is when you incentivize the banks to make loans because they can't lose. You by definition they're going to do stupid stuff.
Yeah, it's moral hazard. I mean, it's
exactly.
Just,
it's moral hazard, which you should define. I mean, moral hazard is if people don't have consequences for making stupid decisions,
they're going to make the stupid.
They're going to make the stupid decisions. If they think like a bank, if they think they're going to win either way, well, then they'll push it and they'll do marginal things.
Of course, no doubt.
Yeah.
So here you put in the hands of conservative banks, fractional reserve banking can work, but greed gets in the way.
Exactly.
Some hold reserves of only 10%, while some hold even less, which you talked about the Lehman Brothers.
Yeah.
So Sir Josiah Stamp has this quote, the 1927 director of the Bank of England.
Yeah.
The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in iniquity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money. And with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again.
Isn't that something? I mean, this guy was a director of the Bank of England, and I think he said that in 1927. I mean, the system, look, this is a very good system for bankers. Let's face it.
Yeah. So the other idea of it is this, how the cycle fuels these repeating booms and busts, especially when inflation rises and you've got all these malinvestments. You've got recessions, depressions, financial panic, all triggered by this cycle of reckless lending, followed by the inevitable collapse of the bad investments. I think it was Hayek was it Hayek or Mises who basically was talking about, when the Fed was created, it was going to create this collapse of epic proportions because there's going to be all this malinvestment and you're going to mess with the price of money and it's going to cause this huge problem. And boy, was he right.
Yeah, he was absolutely right. I mean, it didn't take long. I mean, they were created in 1913. They immediately financed World War I. Then, they actually tried to behave responsibly after World War I. They tightened the money supply and you had a small depression and downturn in 20 and 21. But they, quickly things turned in the other direction, and they were very accommodative during the balance of the century, which led to the big bubble of 1929.
before they established the Fed, there was the Panic of 1907.
Right.
I didn't really know all this, but how can you explain?
Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was the same old, same old. I mean, the New York banks had gotten very, very, and there was one in 1873 as well, but the New York banks had gotten very, very levered, and there was a business downturn, and so they were way out over their skis in terms of leverage, and as loans were called, some of them were looking at failing. At the time, J.P. Morgan, who ran the largest bank in New York, was kind of the kingpin, and they went to him, and he basically privately with other bankers constructed a bailout and kind of said, look, okay, I'll put up this money, you put up this money, we'll calm the waters and we'll stop the quote unquote panic that if it had gone to its full extension would have led to a Great Depression like outcome. A lot of banks would have failed at that time. And so he did that and held everything together. But I think what it was for most of the bankers at the time was it was a big wake up call that, oh my God, this is a recurring problem. And it's getting really big. And I don't think Morgan lived that long after that period of time. I'm not sure when he died. Actually, Paul, maybe you can Google that. But, long story short, the bankers realized that, it was a very stark reminder of how at risk they were in a major downturn. And that maybe the next time there wouldn't be a JP Morgan to broker a solution. And so they began thinking, okay, we need to put together something that puts the government in the role of J.P. Morgan, wherein they give us control of the currency, such that if we have that downturn and we need to, we can print the money to keep the system going.
Interesting.
So that's what happened.
They really established a bank cartel here. What's funny is even today, right? Like who's the J.P. Morgan guy right now? The head of the family, I'm trying to remember.
Oh, Jamie Dimon? No.
Jamie Dimon.
Yeah.
They recently, do you remember with the whole Silvergate and all this stuff? Well, I had an account at a bank called First Republic.
Sure.
So even today, I had real estate.
I was at Silicon Valley Bank.
Yeah. So just funny, interesting that they leaned on Jamie Dimon even today to go buy First Republic. He actually,
and they gave him concessions. They gave him concessions to do it. They also leaned on him to buy Bear Stearns when Bear Stearns failed.
Yeah.
And they leaned on all the banks when LTCM failed in 1998.
Yeah, wild.
I'm sorry. The question that you wanted me to search was how.
Yeah, just when he died. So 1913. Yeah. So the panic of 1907. J.P. Morgan died in 1913.
So he died right around when the Fed was established.
Yeah. It says here 9 months.
6 months later, yeah. Wow.
About 9 months after his death, yeah.
Yeah, 9 months, okay. So he didn't even live to see the Fed's creation. Wow. Interesting. One other term that I think is important to define, you wrote here, this idea of malinvestment. People probably have an understanding of that term if you've never heard it. But the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, he described it as improper allocations of capital that occur as the result of periods of artificially low interest rates.
Exactly.
So when the Federal Reserve is artificially putting their thumb on the scales and incentivizing this stuff, we talked about it with ZERP. It's like, you like heads I win, tails you lose.
Yeah,
right?
Whenever anybody
there's no consequences.
Whenever anyone uses the word malinvestment, I know they get it. They're an Austrian economist because the Austrians really. They coined that phrase, I believe, and defined it as, people who are, as a result of the wrong signals in the interest rate environment, they make investments, they overexpand. And then, of course, that excess capacity is not necessary. And when that becomes obvious, the debt that was used for that overexpansion goes bad.
So the Fed's established. The Fed ensures the banks are protected while taxpayers foot the bill when things go wrong.
Yeah.
Nice work if you can get it. So if things had, if J.P. Morgan wasn't there to bail out things in 1907, what would have happened? What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, maybe somebody else would have stepped in. Maybe they would have collectively done it. It's possible that we would have had some serious bank failures and maybe on a go-forward basis, bankers would have been more careful. I don't know. I mean, I would kind of imagine that's the likely outcome. That there would have been a much bigger financial crisis.
Yeah,
and that maybe the right lesson the bankers should have learned from that was, leverage kills, and we get over levered, we're going to blow things up.
Yeah.
And they should restrain themselves and say, okay, we're only going to take on, I don't know, 40% leverage or something. We're not going to be levered 10-1 or 30-1.
No doubt about it. So you wrote here, originally the Fed has so-called noble aims: act as the lender of last resort, prevent and stop bank runs by lending against good collateral at penalty rates. That sounds funny to me.
Yeah. Well, that was Walter Bagot, who was a famous financial writer in the 1800s, wrote that. He said, central banks, the role of a central bank should be to lend against good collateral at a penalty rate for a short period of time to stop a panic.
So like when they just did this recent thing here with all these banks that had government debt, which is supposed to be good collateral. Yeah. But they sure as hell didn't lend at a penalty rate. It was like
ZIRP is not a penalty rate.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. Provide a flexible or elastic currency to manage the recurring bouts of inflation and deflation, which had plagued the nation's development, and offer stability during financial crisis.
These were the selling points. These were the selling points of the Fed.
Almost immediately, the Fed strayed from its mandate. By 1916 to 1917, rule changes allowed it to finance the U.S. Treasury's World War I expenses, violating its charter of only lending against real bills with heavy collateral coverage. The mission creep was unsurprising to skeptics.
Yep. They immediately did what they said they were not going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So this brings us to these Liberty bonds. Yeah. This was a win-win for the government that got its ward paid for and the banks that made a profit financing the same. The loser was the consumer, who was soon to be hit by inflation. Sound familiar?
Yeah, the price level doubled from World War I.
So, the balance sheet, the Fed's balance sheet, a proxy for the money supply, ballooned from under $4 billion in 1914 to $7.7 billion by 1920. I guess inflation got up to 8 to 17% per year throughout that period. So for many of us Austrians, we're not surprised one bit.
Not a bit.
When you just increase the money supply. Wow. By 1920, a dollar purchased half as much as it did in 1914. The price level had doubled. It seems just like COVID, essentially.
Pretty much.
Same thing. Yeah. Wow.
I don't think the price level doubled in COVID, but it's definitely up 50%.
It really seems that way. I mean, some things.
Well, it depends. It depends on the item.
Yeah. Because I think, at some
and we know the numbers are cooked a little bit too.
Of course. Yeah. It's really hard to know. They've really gamed the metrics. The cantillionaires and the government officials, they really have the game down now. I mean, they do make these adjustments and they remove stuff if it really starts inflating. That's my favorite. Like, coffee inflated by 200% this month.
Substitution.
We gotta just take that. You gotta drink tea now. Yeah, sure we are. Everyone's walking around drinking tea now, don't you see?
Right.
Nobody has coffees anymore.
No.
Classic. Oh, man. Let's see here. What is you say here that unlike today or during the Great Depression, there was no interference in the pricing mechanism after inflation really started from World War I.
Where are you? I'm not sure.
Chairman Benjamin Strong raised the discount rate from 4% to 7% and held it there for 18 months. This triggered a serious downturn and commodity prices plummeted 50%. Manufacturing contracted by 42% and unemployment rose fivefold to 11.9%. But unlike today or during the Great Depression, there was no interference in the pricing mechanism. It feels like there are all these like little games they play.
Yeah,
you look at different periods of time. It's like hard to.
Yeah, well, they let prices fall. Mm-hmm. In the Depression, they subsidized labor and they held prices up. So, and there weren't labor unions at this time. I mean, the market. I guess what I'm trying to say there is the market cleared. It very and that clearing. I mean, James Grant wrote a great book on this, the silent depression of the 1920s. That market clearing put us back on things started things got sound again very quickly, and the economy in the early 20s did well.
Gotcha. We come to Charles Ponzi's infamous Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, 1919.
What? How did this all occur?
Well, I guess the point I tried to make here in this whole segment, I talk about that. I talk about some other things that happened at the time that were bad. I mean.
Today we got SBF with his scheming.
Exactly. I mean, inflation tears at the social fabric. Okay, you had all kinds of riots, you had more lynchings, you had the attack on the community. I believe it was a black community in Oklahoma. You had a lot of strikes, labor strife. All this because the prices of everything had doubled, and people were pissed off, and it kind of echoes or it mirrors what we're going through right now. I mean, there's a lot of dysfunction in this country. There's a lot of political anger. And I would submit that probably the inflation is probably the biggest cause, the underlying cause of all of it. And so it's interesting, too, at the time back in the 1920s, the solution, the progressives came along and their solution was, this is all because of alcohol. You guys are drinking too much. And so that's how they pushed through Prohibition and the Volstead Act.
Wow.
They didn't realize the real issue was the money, but they thought it was alcohol.
Yeah, it's funny. There's all the, Dominic Frisby talks a lot about this, and the main reason they were able to actually get this through because alcohol taxes and stuff really is what funded the government. It was a huge
they're making money on it.
But this is kind of how we got the income tax because they needed to replace it with something, so they couldn't push this through until they.
Oh, interesting! I hadn't thought about that connection.
There's a lot of tax history.
They were also getting a lot of money out of tariffs, which kind of rhymes with what we're trying to do now, right?
Yeah. So it's very interesting.
And the federal government was a lot smaller at that point in time, too.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
I mean,
it wasn't doing. There wasn't
5,000 agencies.
There was no Department of Education. There was no, FDA. I mean, a lot of the stuff just didn't exist. So.
Oh man, this brings us to Weimar Germany. Can you tell us a little bit about that and kind of what happened?
The quick and brief overview is that obviously Germany lost World War I. And very, very badly so. And the Allies who won put enormous reparations on them for starting the war, and so they owed in gold terms a lot of money to all the Allies who had won the war. And there was a guy named George Knapp who was the original MMT sponsor. He believed in something called chartalism, which is that he believed that money was not tied to any physical good like gold or silver, but that money was actually a creation of the state. So he was kind of the original supporter of fiat as being the ultimate form of money. And what he advised the German government to do, and what they did was they printed money to pay their debts. They printed money to buy gold. They printed money to do all kinds of things. And it started off fine. People didn't really realize it, although notice there was inflation. And this was the war. So the war ended, in 1917, 18? Maybe it was 16, actually. It was an armistice. But in 17, 18, it kind of started. It wasn't a big deal. But creeping into the 20s, it became a big deal. And by 1923, I believe it was, the mark was worthless. They had printed so many of them that the Deutschmark became worthless. And so it was the first modern case of hyperinflation in a real economy. I mean, Germany was a large, substantial, civilized economy. This was not, Zimbabwe. And they figured they could continue to print money to pay their debts. And obviously, at some point, it was a case of a mass case of Gresham's law, where eventually you print too much money. Everybody realizes you're going to print too much money. Everyone says this money has no value. Yeah, I don't want it. And so at the end of that episode, people were getting paid, and they were literally racing to the grocery store to buy their food. Yeah, because they knew that prices would go up. There's stories. I'm not sure if they're true, but there were stories about how the price of your dinner might change from the time when you sat down to the time when
it's completely true.
Yeah, the time you were done. So, it was a massive inflation, and by the end, the mark was worthless.
Yeah, I know. In South America, there's an actual job for people like grocery stores in some of these countries with hyperinflating currencies, where your sole job, is to walk around the store all day long and just change the prices. That's literally a job.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but
it's hard to believe.
But it happens when currencies fail.
When high inflation hits a country, it often tears the social fabric. I thought that was an interesting take. Do you think at the end after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles, do you feel that the victors of the war really, obviously with Germany, they were responsible for pretty much all the debt because they lost the war,
right?
Obviously.
One could argue, and I think history has argued. Many have made the strong argument that backfired. That in other words, trying to get Germany to pay those reparations was not an intelligent move.
Yeah, it really highlights this idea that there's really no winners in war.
That's right.
Right, because the whole world ended up losing because of what we
because
did
then
there.
they had hyperinflation. The hyperinflation led to Hitler.
Yeah.
And really, World War I and World War II were kind of the same war. It just never ended. There was just a break.
Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. I certainly feel that way.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to the premise of the book: fix the money, fix the world.
Right. It wouldn't have occurred with sound money.
I want to read a really good quote from Murray Rothbard that you included in your book. I think it's a great one. So many great quotes in this book. The financial elites of this country, notably the Morgan, Rockefeller, and Kuhn, Loeb interests were responsible for putting through the Federal Reserve System as a governmentally created and sanctioned cartel device to enable the nation's banks to inflate the money supply in a coordinated fashion without suffering quick retribution from depositors or note holders demanding cash. Recent researchers, however, have also highlighted the vital supporting role of the growing number of technocratic experts and academics who were happy to lend the patina of their allegedly scientific expertise to support the elite's drive for a central bank. To achieve a regime of big government and government control, power elites cannot achieve their goal of privilege through statism without the vital legitimizing support of the supposedly disinterested experts in the professoriate.
Exactly.
To achieve the Leviathan state, interest-seeking special privilege and intellectuals offering scholarship and ideology must work hand in hand. Murray Rothbard.
Exactly right. And I detail in other parts of the book of how that's happened and how the Fed spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year endowing university chairs and paying monetary scholars to support the Fed. And so
it is such a conflict of interest that you cannot even make this shit up. I mean, it's so ridiculous.
Of course it is. And this is why and they've used CIA tactics where they've labeled gold supporters and sound money people as conspiracy theorists, and they call us gold bugs.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And they've tried to portray sound money as being something beyond the pale.
Yeah.
Because they've got their nice little system. And this is why Paul Krugman gets, the Nobel Prize for economics and gets paid millions of dollars to give speeches and to write books.
Talks about missing the forest for the trees.
Well,
we'll read his quote.
But he's one of many.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many people like this. And if you're in their system, you do extremely well. I mean, another data point in the book. I mean, Janet Yellen, who was has been Treasury Secretary and head of the Federal Reserve, has received $7 million in speaking fees from financial interests. Right. Well, I personally consider those to be bribes. Right. Yeah. I mean, she supports their system. And they pay her $200,000 an hour to come and talk. And I'm kind of like, what is it this lady has to say that's worth $200,000, right?
Yeah.
So they go hand in glove. The universities, the Keynesian economists, the monetary scholars, the people who run the Fed, they're all in the same boat, right?
And the taxpayers on the hook for a good portion of it. I mean,
correct. I mean, what's amazing to me,
you're stealing money from the front end and the back end. It's going out the front and the back
now, but I believe the Federal Reserve has like 40,000 employees.
Can you believe that?
I mean, what the heck do they do? They've got over 1,000 PhD economists.
It is unbelievable.
And yet they continually blow every call.
I mean, it's kind of
like, what are we paying all these people to do?
Like the parasitism and it's unbelievable how many parasites there are just sucking from the productive society,
right?
And yet society still goes on. It just sometimes it amazes. It really truly does amaze me.
I agree with you.
It's wild. Oh man, Brian O'Brien. What a name, Brian O'Brien.
Yeah, he had a great line, quote. He wrote a nice little book. Yeah.
The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was a rejection of American values. It put into place a system that was unaccountable to the people, without checks and balances, in which concentrated power in the hands of the few who were given the authority to make decisions in secrecy that affect the lives of all of us. The system was purposely designed to operate without the consent of the governed. I love that.
Yeah.
Man. 100 years after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, by any objective measure, the Federal Reserve has failed to protect us from the very thing its architects told us it was designed to prevent.
Yeah.
The United States was struck by a severe depression when World War I came to a close. 16 years after the passage of the act, our nation suffered the most devastating and catastrophic depression in our history, the Great Depression.
Right.
All predicted, I believe, by von Mises, or was it Hayek? It was either Hayek or probably von Mises.
Von Mises.
Yeah. Which, he called it, man. He nailed it.
Yep.
When the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, it promised to tame the wild swings of the business cycle. A century later, the data tells a different story. I think that was what you wrote.
Yeah.
It's very wild. It really is. Here you said the entire world economy is linked to energy, and so the price of energy is hugely important to input for economic calculations. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah,
Talk a little bit about
we have a world that's run on energy, and the chart here, there's a very good chart in the book. It's on page 74 that just shows how stable, and oil is the major energy input for much of the world. It's not the only one, but the biggest one. And there's a chart in here from Luke Groman. It's a great chart which shows how stable the oil price was in gold terms from the founding of the country until the creation of the Fed, and then just how unstable it has become since we untethered the money, or we created the Fed and we untethered the money in the sense of fractional reserve banking. And then, of course, it even got more unstable after 1971 when we went off the gold standard. And so, if you think about an economy as business people trying to plan and do things, they need to know and understand what the prices of things are going to be on a go-forward basis. And when the prices are unstable, they're moving around all the time because the money supply is being fiddled with by the Federal Reserve. You get all these perverse outcomes, and productivity is lost. This is like back to the 500 millimeter shaft that's ordered by the engineer, and he can't coordinate with the other guy if the definition of a millimeter is always changing. So, I think the point of the chart is just that when you're messing with the money, the price of one of the most important inputs starts bouncing around like crazy.
Yeah, it makes it very difficult.
It makes it very difficult for anybody to plan and to make things more efficient. And that's the thing that I think, people need to understand. Or an important point I want to make with the book is we live quite well right now. I mean, we do and we don't. Things are broken. But look, it's, the world operates, and, we're all thankful we live better than people did 100 years ago because we have all kinds of inventions and so forth. However, let's also remember that it could be much better still.
Yeah.
It could have been much, much better still. All this technology productivity that's been brought to the table, it hasn't been equally distributed. It's been distributed at the top. And there's been a lot of lost opportunity. There's been a lot of money wasted on stupid stuff. And I believe with sound money, that would not have happened. I mean, we wouldn't have wasted $8 trillion fighting wars in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is just unbelievable.
Think about that.
How they got away with that. I mean, that's unbelievable.
Right.
That chart is striking on the bottom of the page with the oil prices, where you just look throughout, World War I, all these other periods, and then you just see what the fuck happened in 1971.
Right.
It's wild.
We know what happened.
yeah, no doubt. The other important point to look at, I think, which I find important, is how the mainstream economists, right, the Keynesians, if you look at the Great Depression and evaluate it, we've kind of touched on it a little bit. Ben Bernanke and Harold James, they've got this whole thing about, the result of a mismanaged international gold standard, blah, 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 just sustained inflation.
They try and blame the depression on the gold standard, which is just, that's a real cheap shot. That's just not what caused it. It was a credit bubble.
When you look at history, it's just so obvious, right? It's like looking back, you wrote here, the depression, he is wrong. The depression was the natural occurrence of deflation following the collapse of an enormous inflationary credit bubble that developed between 1921 and 29. The Fed's excessively loose and accommodative monetary policy during the 1920s supplied the air. Then it burst. To expect that the inevitable pop was not going to be bad is disingenuous or naive. Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, so it was von Mises, advised that if you want to avoid depressions, you start by not allowing easy money bubbles to form. And he wrote, "There is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. The alternative is only whether the crisis should come sooner as the result of voluntary abandonment of further credit expansion, or later as a final and total catastrophe of the currency system involved." It's unbelievable how we've as a society taken the latter route, and every time the bubble just seems to grow and grow and grow, and people like you and me are like, how the fuck can this go on? Yet these Keynesian wizards, they
keep it going on.
They keep it going. I mean, it's kind of wild. It really, got to give them credit, man. It's impressive.
Yeah.
They get away with it.
Yeah,
You know?
they have.
So the Great Depression unfolded exactly as von Mises described, when public confidence finally broke and further credit expansion became impossible. So yeah, it played out exactly as predicted. Wild. The other aspect. Did you have any further thoughts on that whole thing?
No. You covered it well.
Yeah, okay. The other thing that I thought was interesting that I kind of highlighted here was this idea of 1914 when Britain went off the gold standard, obviously, to finance the World War I.
Yeah.
You wrote that it marked a significant shift in global economic power. And one thing that I never really knew or understood was this whole idea of kind of how America and Benjamin Strong, who was the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, kind of helped Montagu Norman, who was the head of the Bank of England. It was almost like this collusion of like elites, and it's kind of what we talk about. It kind of seems.
Yeah, no, the fact that the U.S. was trying to help England return to the gold standard by creating inflation here was a big part of that credit bubble. Yeah,
it seems like that's almost. Why do you think they did that? I mean, was this like the very beginning of kind of like this globalist idea? Were we just trying to help an ally? I mean, what?
I think we're trying to help an ally. Yeah. I think part of why they let the 20s go the way they did was also that the depression of 1920 was fresh in their minds. They didn't want to see another one of those. It was painful.
Yeah.
And my sense is that they were kind of like, okay, well, let's err on the side of of printing, or of keeping credit, of keeping interest rates too low. So I think both those things contributed.
From 1920, the Fed embarked on 7 years of loose money. The numbers tell the story. U.S. money supply surged from $45.3 billion to $73.3 billion between 1921 and 1928, a staggering 61.8% increase, averaging 7.7% annually. Price inflation was mild because increased productivity reduced goods prices while asset prices soared. The increase in the monetary base went into financial assets and blew an enormous stock market and credit bubble. Total debt in the system was $173 billion in 1929, while the monetary base was little over $6 billion, roughly a 28-to-1 ratio. Can you compare that to today?
Yeah, I think I did in the book, actually. I think right now we've got total credit of somewhere around $100 billion and a monetary base of somewhere around $6 billion. I was listening to Lynn recently talking about that. Today, yes, today we have about $100 trillion of debt and a monetary base of 5.6. So that's 18-to-1. So it was higher back in 1920.
It was higher in the 20s.
But not incredibly so.
Yeah, it just I thought it was wild to point that out. That even today we're less than what how crazy it was in the Great Depression.
20s.
Yeah, the 20s, the roaring 20s as they call it.
Yeah.
Which was, I think when you're trying to have a communist board plan things, I guess you kind of learn from your lessons over time a little bit, and obviously the free market is the best arbiter of these things. But when the communist board, they kind of learn, oh shit, we really fucked this one up.
Yeah,
next time we can't let it get too crazy, right? So thought it was wild. What is the Fed funds interest rate? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the Fed at any point in time is willing to lend to the banks at some price. And that really is how the interest rates are in an economy are set. They will create new money as needed at that price. And so it's called the Fed's fund rate, and it's been around for a long, long time. And banks, if they are running short on capital, they can go to they can go to the Fed and they can borrow at that rate. And then, of course, they relend it at something higher than that rate, and that's how they make their interest rate spread. So it is basically the base layer interest rate at which money is created in an economy.
And we've got 100,000 academics that we're paying.
No, 1,000 PhD economists.
1,000 PhD economists.
40,000 employees at
40,000 employees. They're all
working. They're working on that problem
to try to
set
figure
that
out
rate.
how to set the market rate.
Well, and as you can see today, I mean, in fact, today is a Fed day. Powell is supposed to speak this afternoon, and he's going to announce no rate change, we believe. But but the long story short is that
98% chance of no rate.
Right. Yeah.
You never know.
The long story short is that these announcements are probably the most heavily watched thing in the financial markets because the cost of money drives all of these markets very substantially.
Wild. Let's talk a little bit about Roosevelt.
Sure.
His approach centered on breaking the deflationary spiral through dollar devaluation against gold. His policy took place in two very controversial steps. First, in April 1933, Roosevelt issued the infamous Executive Order 6102.
Yeah, he confiscated all the gold. So America was in a deflationary depression. And the mistake the Fed made was actually not supporting the banks, which they were designed to do, but they followed the real bills doctrine. And so they let, I think 30,000 banks fail. And that really deepened and made the depression even worse. That was in 32 and 33.
You mentioned this real bills doctrine earlier.
That means is that the Fed could only loan against, it was meant to only be loaning against real commercial bills of sale, so that if somebody were, back in that time, what would happen is if you produced corn, you would get a bill for the corn, and the corn would then go into a mill, and then the mill would have a bill, and they would pass it on to the baker. The baker would have a bill, and they would pass it on to the bake shop that sold it or the food producer that sold it. And those bills passed around, and so the Fed was only supposed to be loaning against those bills, not just making unsecured loans against anything. And what happened is all these small banks got in deep trouble. They were over leveraged. The prices were collapsing. Their customers were failing. Yeah. And they actually needed, they didn't have an FDIC at the time. They actually needed an FDIC. They needed something to prevent the banks from failing. And they didn't know what it was. They didn't have the imagination or the vision to do it. They did have the imagination and vision to take the interest rate down very much and try to establish, let money grow in that way. But but of course no one was willing to lend, and so the failure of the banks was what I think caused the depression to be as bad as it was, more so than basically Bernanke said to Milton Friedman once, we made a mistake, we didn't print enough money, we didn't do enough QE, although I think they did a little QE. I don't know historically, that it's a little unclear how much they did, but they definitely took rates down quite a bit, and Bernanke said they would never make that mistake again, and that's why he came with such big QE. But I would suggest that the actual mistake they made is they didn't fulfill their mission of supporting the banks.
Yeah, the lender of last resort.
They weren't the lender of last resort to the small banks. They were to the bigger ones, I believe, because they gave them low-cost credit. The bigger ones knew how to get around it. The small guys didn't really know, and so they all failed. The bottom line is that then they were in a depressionary event, and in a depressionary event, deflationary event, the debts were larger than the underlying money supply could service. And so what they had to do is they had to deflate the value of the dollar. And so after Roosevelt grabbed all the gold, he devalued the dollar 69% in gold terms. He struck the price. It went from $20.67 to $34 an ounce, or 30. I think it was 34 originally. Maybe it went up to after that, but $35 an ounce. And that devaluation was.
I feel like history. I feel like they're just laughing at us.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
It had to be 69%.
Yeah.
It couldn't be any other number. It was 69%.
There's going to be it was a reset, and to be objective about it, it actually made a difference. I mean, 34, the economy did start to recover. The taking the dollar down in terms of value actually sparked an economic recovery in 34. But sadly, it didn't last, and they ran into further problems with a lot of other things later in that decade. But yeah, Roosevelt was trying to get us out of a deflationary depression.
So he kind of a insane.
He did a
attack on property rights, but
there was that too. I mean, the whole notion. I mean, it was contested in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. But the notion that
was the court case I was thinking. There's a famous dissent on that. Which is
the notion that he could grab citizens' gold. I mean, it's just what
completely un-American.
Yeah, very, very un-American. Now he paid them money for it. He paid them cash for it, but then he immediately devalued the cash.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wild. What is this idea of this deflationary psychology? It said that it achieved its objective of breaking the deflationary psychology.
Well, as I say, people began to believe that it might work, and the notion that prices were going to keep falling started to disappear because the dollar was now cheaper. And so you make the dollar cheaper, prices are going to go up. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin. And so what he did was he devalued the dollar, And that when you devalue the dollar, it's the same as revaluing goods and services. And so prices go up. So suddenly the deflationary psychology, people start seeing prices go up and they think, oh, okay, well, health is returning here.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. You mentioned the Smoot-Hawley tariffs just a little bit.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on those?
Well, they contributed. We're seeing tariffs. They contributed to the depression, no doubt. I mean, international trade was a meaningful part of the business back in those days. But I think they probably, in my opinion, they've probably been overly blamed. I don't think I think there were a lot of other things going on that made the depression worse. It wasn't just Smoot-Hawley, but this was a period of time where we were kind of reaching inward and thinking to ourselves, screw all those foreigners who are mercantilists and are trying to sell us goods on the cheap. We're not going to let them do that. And it's amazing how that rhymes with what we're doing right now.
Yeah, interesting. That's why I wanted to point it out. It's just, different.
Same idea.
Yeah. It's during the Civil War, before the Civil War, there was also, the War of 1812. We kind of talked about it a little bit differently, but there was also a big tariff story in that. I spoke with Dominic about that.
Yeah, cotton.
Yeah, just a huge,
Some argue that triggered that war.
That was really what the conclusion that he came to in his book. And I, after reading his book and going down that rabbit hole, I agree with him. I mean, there's famous quotes by Abraham Lincoln, talking about it and, just kind of the way it all acted. And before, when those first shots were fired, he didn't want to give up the fort. It was like, but what about the revenue, right? That was kind of what he said. It was a famous quote attributed to him. For multiple sources. So, it was definitely a major factor. But what I thought was interesting was that after the War of 1812, the South, who would suffer from tariffs, essentially said, "Hey, we got to have tariffs. We have to have some domestic production so we can produce stuff in case there's a war."
Right.
And it's a national security thing. They were the ones advocating for it, to basically protect the North a little bit and say, "Hey, we need you to produce. We have to have some domestic production." There's so many different. It's interesting how these things can play out in different scenarios and. Can be a good thing in some scenarios, and what's the right level, and all these factors.
Right.
History it's not so simple, right? We can look back, obviously, with foresight or feel like hindsight, and see like, oh, we would have done this or we would have done that, but
you didn't know.
There's an expression, something about the fog. I think, almost like the fog of war, where you really, in that
you
moment,
don't actually know.
Yeah. This brings us to World War II. So World War II finally ended the Great Depression. It looks like, obviously, anytime there's war, guess what? The printing press is primed, right?
Yeah.
I have watched TV and movies about this period. It's just kind of wild to me to believe that we had all these price controls and all these different things. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, it was an existential threat. Fascism, was something that had to be dealt with. We were attacked, and one could argue that we provoked the attack on Japan's part, but they did attack us. And, I think we believed strongly that having a free Europe was an important thing to have, that we didn't want to have fascist dictator running all of Europe. And so, we entered World War II and it was existential. And it's interesting to me that the country really rallied behind it. You know what I mean? I remember my grandparents talking about all the restrictions. I mean, you couldn't get tires, you couldn't get meat, you couldn't get a lot of things because of the quotas, but it was kind of like people just put up with it because they knew that it was all part of the war effort and we had to win.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a different country in that time, and people, I think, were much more civically minded than perhaps they are today, although I think everyone's still civically minded, but it's hard to, this was a big unifying force, right, that caused people to pull behind it. And by the way, the Fed helped. I mean, the Fed helped them get it done by using yield curve control. And
can you explain that? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So
I hear that a lot. But
well, they had to sell a lot of bonds. The war was expensive. They ran enormous deficits. And to pay for those deficits, they had to sell bonds. They had enormous war bond drives. Everyone's seen the posters, heard the stories. And if there weren't enough buyers of war bonds, then the Fed would be a buyer of the war bonds. And so the Fed's balance sheet grew substantially, and the amount of debt that the country was carrying grew substantially up into the north of 100%. I think it grew to like
113%.
113% was the peak, I believe. And of course, in so doing, they were smart enough to realize that kind of debt was going to lead to large interest expenses if they let the market rate for interest rates prevail. And so they instituted yield curve control. And a couple of years into the war, the Fed said, the short yield security. I can't remember which it was. I believe it was like the 1 year, the 2 year was, or maybe the 30-day.
3/8.
Yeah, it was going to yield 3/8 of 1%. And they were going to cap the longer yielding securities, I think at 2.5%. Is that what I wrote?
That's accurate.
Yeah. And so, and they just held them there. And so, those bonds were not a good investment because there was a lot of inflation in the war.
You're going to lose.
And there was even more inflation after the war.
Yeah.
But I think, investors and people in the country were willing to put up with it because we had to win the war.
Yeah, they knew it was existential.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
they didn't mind getting, debased a little bit in real terms, maybe. But also the government just printed money and, bought those bonds with the printed money.
Right.
What's striking to me is here in your book, you have that, obviously during that war effort, the GDP was 113%, but today we're
It's
at
higher.
123%, not in any war.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah. Well, that's what happens when you waste money.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine that. Like that's,
Right.
a lot of people talk about this idea that when it reaches a certain point, historically every country's failed. I think it was like 120, was 140% or
Yeah, there's another at a later point
You
in
might
the
have talked
book.
about it a little bit later
I've got
on,
a schedule that shows it was done by Hirschman Capital. It shows that
that's
when
what it was,
when countries get to kind of 120, 130% debt to GDP,
it's kind of like
they
that
typically have a problem, a serious problem.
debt loop kind of.
Yeah, they either have massive inflation, collapse, or hyperinflation.
Yeah, the only exception that I can think of right now is like Japan.
That's right. Japan is the one notable exception.
But I told you they're doing 100-year mortgages. And
Well, there's that, and they really are a special case because they're an export-driven economy and they've got a lot of savings.
yeah. So obviously the losers with all this were the ones who held the long-term bonds and saw the value of their bonds severely eroded. This rhymes with what I believe will happen today. Interesting. Unlike today's financial engineering solutions, the nation grew and earned its way out of the debt trap, gradually restoring debt to GDP to sustainable levels. Do you think it's a possibility that we can do the same now with AI and with some of this technological breakthroughs and productivity gains?
I think those things will definitely help.
Mm-hmm.
They're all to the positive, just as Doge is to the positive.
Yeah,
I think the problem is that we're very, very far gone in this cycle, and that it's going to be too little too late, and that the cycle has to play itself out in terms of a reset of the currency. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, they will help, but will they solve the problem alone? No. There needs to be a debt currency reset. And I say that in the book, and I talk about some of the policies to do that in the book.
Tell us about Bretton Woods a little bit. What is your take on Bretton Woods?
Well, so they made a mistake. So Bretton Woods is the monetary conference that happened in 1944. The war was almost over, and most countries had left the gold standard during the war. And so the question was up for debate. What are we going to do for a monetary standard on a go-forward basis, right? And what they decided to do was they decided to because the United States had the largest balance of gold, and because the United States was about to win the war massively, and because we had the most productive economy since all the other countries had been somewhat war ravaged, they decided to set the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency with its gold backing it at a $35 per ounce rate, and they created a gold exchange standard whereby a foreign country that held U.S. dollars could swap them for gold out of the United States, and then they pegged all the interest or all the currencies to the U.S. dollar. So all the countries had to maintain the same relationship to the dollar. They had to be within like 1% of the original starting rate of the dollar. So that was meant to be the go forward system of the monetary world. And in some ways, it was a decent system because, the U.S. did have a stable monetary system. We did have a lot of gold, and the dollar was, quote unquote, at the time as good as gold. But it had an inherent flaw in it, and that is that we became the reserve currency. And therefore,
Triffin's dilemma, essentially.
And it created Triffin's dilemma, which is to say that all the other countries couldn't really earn dollars unless we ran trade deficits. And so that became a problem, and it made the dollar artificially more valuable than it should have been, and that's what led to the hollowing out of our industry over time. And it's interesting. John Maynard Keynes, who I do not like at all, he actually kind of somewhat foresaw this, and he proposed something called a Bancor.
Bancor, yeah,
which would have been an international reserve currency with a fixed supply.
It'd be harder to game. I actually thought it was not a bad idea.
Yeah.
I mean,
so he saw it. He saw what Triffin saw, and he realized we needed a quote unquote neutral reserve currency. My personal view is that what they should have done is not had the dollar at a fixed price to gold. They should have actually let gold be the neutral reserve currency, right? And then let all the other currencies float against gold, including the dollar. And if they had done that, then Triffin's dilemma would not have existed, and that would have been the correct solution.
Interesting. Do you like how the two guys that were kind of responsible, the guys at the forefront of Bretton Woods, obviously was Keynes, but also was our guy Harry Dexter White.
Harry Dexter White, yeah.
Do you like? I guess they said he was a communist spy and all this stuff. Was he? Was that
That's true.
Is that actually true?
That is actually true. Yeah.
I mean, like, it made me think, like, my brain go to, like, did he help? But he kind of, like, he wanted the U.S. to be the head of this. Do you think he did this intentionally, like, with an understanding of Triffin's dilemma?
No.
Okay.
I don't think he understood Triffin's dilemma. I think he was probably trying to do what was in the United States' best interest. But
how is he then?
I don't know.
How did that help the communists? I'm so confused.
Yeah, I haven't read the detailed story of his relationship with the communists.
That's fascinating.
But it is known that he had contact with and arguably was a spy for those people. And
wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's having said all of that, it still was a system that benefited the U.S. So I don't think he was doing it to help the communists.
Gotcha. Because if you understood Triffin's dilemma, you'd think that yes, initially it would help, but eventually it would be
a problem.
Yeah, but I don't know, just a crazy thought I had.
Yeah.
Obviously, this starts to take us to 1971, which is one of the most important dates in all of American history, I think.
I agree.
How did that come to be?
Well, so really what drove it was over the course. So from 1945 or 6, when the war was over, until 1971. The U.S. was fairly well managed, and they were not running deficits, and taxation, supplied what was necessary to run the government. That began to change with the Korean War. Those were the first deficits we ran. They were relatively small, but so in those couple of years in the 1950s, we ran some deficits there, and you can see that in the inflation chart. There was a little bit of inflation as a result of that because they were monetized. But then, we went back to being in a stable fiscal condition in the 50s. But then in the 60s, the Vietnam War got started just as a police action, but it became much more than that as the 60s progressed. And at the same time, after Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson put in this Great Society program where he established a lot of social programs, and including Medicare and other things. And those were costly. And so he began what we all affectionately call the guns and butter policy, which is we can have these social programs that are expensive, and we can have the Vietnam War, which requires guns, which are expensive, and we'll just pay for it out of printed money. And as that became apparent, and it became apparent to the rest of the world that we were printing more money than we had gold to back that money, our credit was growing. But we were the leading country in the world, so they were willing to look the other way. Some of the countries got wise, and they said, these dollars probably aren't really worth what these people are telling us they're worth because they're printing too many of them. Maybe we should exercise that clause that says we can exchange our dollars for gold and take some of our gold home at $35 an ounce. And so at one point in time, the United States had 20,000 tons of gold.
Yeah.
And now we have 8,100 tons, 133 tons of gold. So we actually lost.
Allegedly.
Well, that's right. So between the time when these countries got smart to the issue and the time when the window was closed in 71, they withdrew 12,000 tons of gold.
I can't believe I'm going to say this, but if a French economist can actually catch on to this,
right? Yeah,
you've got Jacques Rueff.
He was a brilliant monetary economist.
I was about to say, I mean, this guy,
he saw it. He saw it, and he got it. So did Charles de Gaulle. They both saw it, and Rueff was de Gaulle's finance minister. And so, eventually and so this got worse and worse. And so interestingly, in order to counter that, something happened in 1960s. People realized that this was happening, and the price of gold began to trade above the official price. The official price was $35, and people were willing to pay more than that to get a hold of it, right?
Wow.
And so that led to the establishment of something called the London Gold Pool, which was set up in the early 60s and then dissolved in 1967 or 8. And the London Gold Pool was designed to suppress the price of gold. It was all the central banks in the world selling gold as necessary to keep the price of gold at the reference price of $35. And I've heard from a number of sources and people who were, know people that were in the Johnson administration at the time, that what occurred was that some of the Fort Knox gold was sent to London to help with that effort. But eventually that effort got overwhelmed. And so the London gold pool was shut down. And then eventually the French became even more aggressive. And the reported story, and I've never actually been able to verify this, that it happened, but the reported story was that they sent warships to New York and said, give us
I've heard that as well.
Give us our gold. And at that point in time, Nixon and John Connolly, who was the Treasury Secretary, and at the time, Paul Volcker was actually like an undersecretary. He was not Fed head yet. He was like a assistant to the Treasury Secretary, and Arthur Burns and others. And they all went and they met, and there's a book written about this called 3 Days at Camp David. It's a great book. It talks about how they said to themselves, what are we going to do here? If we let this continue, we're going to lose all this gold. And even though gold isn't money anymore, maybe one day it could be money, and that would be strategically weak. We don't want to lose it.
Yeah.
And so Nixon had his famous August 15th Sunday night address where he said, we're going to close the gold window on a temporary basis to prevent international speculators from taking advantage of the United States.
He's the Elizabeth Warrens, Sanders today.
Yeah, so there were kind of three lies in there. It wasn't international speculators; it was foreign countries.
Yeah,
it wasn't temporary, and they weren't taking advantage of the U.S. They were just trying to price the U.S. dollar effectively. And in my opinion, they should have let the price of gold float. I mean, the other solution, everyone says, well, Nixon had to do that; he had no choice. Bullshit. If he'd let the price, if he'd said, no, we are going to break the peg between the gold and the dollar. We are no longer going to exchange dollars for gold. We're going to let the price of gold float in dollar terms, and we will exchange it at whatever the market price is.
Yeah.
The market price would have gone up. Now, we would have had inflation, and Nixon realized that.
Domestic inflation.
And he realized that, and he thought to himself, well, I don't want to have to suffer through that. I want to get reelected.
Yeah.
Right?
How'd that work out for him?
Exactly. It didn't work out so great. Well, actually, no, he did. He got reelected in 72. As you recall, he won in 68, and he won again in 72. But then, of course, he had some other problems.
Oh, I guess you're right. He had some. Right? Yeah.
He had some other issues. So
that's what I meant. It didn't really work
I know.
out.
Yeah, eventually it didn't work out. His political career eventually, obviously, did not work out well.
Those who ride on the back of the tiger often end up inside. It's a JF Kennedy quote. John F. Kennedy.
Well, it's a good quote.
I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, they broke the link to gold, and that of course unleashed all kinds of turmoil. And as we all know, the 70s were an incredibly inflationary decade.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. This is my favorite quote from Nixon on this. Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
Not really.
Soon thereafter, he borrowed a phrase from Milton Friedman. Well, I guess we are all Keynesians now.
Exactly.
When did Milton Friedman say that?
Oh, he said it earlier than that. I can't recall exactly, but he did say it earlier when the guns and butter policy really got going.
Yeah.
He kind of recognized that, and as you'll recall, Friedman was a monetarist. He founded the monetarism school of economics.
Which is the only reason they allowed him to be.
Right.
Like you learn about him in school. You don't learn about the Austrians.
No.
You learn about him because he accepted this whole idea that the price of money can be set by the Fed, right? So he was politically approved. Everything else he was like, his was free markets, except for the most important thing. Like that's just
exactly
classic.
Right.
I love it.
Yeah, exactly right.
He's like, damn, if I want to get my ideas included and have the the Chicago school, and if I want to be mainstream, I got to allow the cabal to set the price of money. I got to
say that's okay.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. I wonder if I truly do wonder if he actually really did believe that, or if he just was.
Good question.
I've always thought about that.
It's a good question
because, like, when you really boil it down to first principles and you think about it, it's so fucking obvious how ridiculous it is.
He was at the end of the day, he was a statist. I mean, he wrote a book with his wife, Schwartz, and it was the monetary history of the United States, and he really believed in our monetary system. And he really believed.
So he did believe. Okay.
He really believed in the Fed. So I don't think he was a closet Austrian who said, "Well, I'm just going to go along with this to get where I want to be." I mean, the guy who actually did that was Greenspan. I mean, Greenspan was he was an Ayn Rand advocate and an Austrian economist. I mean, I didn't put his quote in here. I kind of wish I did, where he said, the shabby thing that fiat people won't tell you is that the gold is the ultimate money, and it is. The shabby secret of the fiat standard is that your money is always going to be debased. I mean, he wrote that in the 60s when he was an acolyte of Ayn Rand.
Fascinating.
Later on, in order to become Fed chairman, he said something different. And he always lied about his view. He always said, well, we're running the Fed as though we are on the gold standard, which is complete bullshit. But that's how he justified his behavior.
The shift to a pure fiat currency triggered immediate market punishment.
Yeah, it did.
Gold prices soared from $35 to $800 by 1980.
Yeah, 22x.
Yeah, staggering. He wrote here a staggering. Is it 22x?
22x. Yeah.
A staggering 2,186% increase, which is a 22x. Wild. That's like it's almost like some Bitcoin numbers.
Yeah, right.
That threatened the very concept of fiat currency. In his memoir, Fed Chairman Volcker commented that one mistake they made during this time frame was to not make a greater effort to control the price of gold. I remember the time well, and a fair number of people actually thought the dollar could fail. Really? Wow. You wrote that going off the gold standard was a crime and also a very irresponsible act. The U.S. defaulted on its Bretton Woods obligation. I could not agree with you more. Let's see here. Yeah, that gold chart really looks like a Bitcoin chart.
Yeah, isn't it something?
Yeah. So tell me more about this, like the manipulation of gold to protect fiat currencies. I know you kind of touched on that briefly, but I'm not too educated on that. But a lot of people have said that first.
There's an organization called Gold Antitrust Action Committee, GATA. And find all their material at gata.org, gata.org. Two guys, Bill Murphy and Chris Powell, run that group. And look, there's just if you read the tea leaves, you read the old government cables, you read just a lot of things. What you can see, I mean, fiat currency and gold compete for, what is the numeraire. And, the long story short is that the government has an incentive to not have the gold price go up, because the gold price going up is what suggests that we've got inflation. And so, as a practical matter, there have been many, many times and many instances where we can see the foot tracks of both the U.S. Fed and other central banks and the BIS, which is the organization that's it's the central bank for all the central banks, have intervened in the gold price, in the gold market, by selling paper gold to try and hold the price of gold down. I mean, that's the layman's quick summary. There's a lot more behind that. And I didn't make that a huge focus of the book, because I'm quite convinced it's occurred. Those of us who are in the gold market know it's occurred. And that's not really the point. The point is that the government tries to suppress the price of gold. Even President Clinton talked about it, and James Carville talked about it, how the bond market, Carville said, "You mean to tell me a bunch of fucking bond traders are going to determine the success of our presidency?" Right? And that's because the bond traders are vigilantes against inflation, and that's all tied to gold. So, basically, and they have, by the way, they have the right guys to help them out. I mean, Robert Rubin, was an ex-gold trader at J. Aron, which was acquired by Goldman Sachs. And so, they had the right guys to help them suppress the price of gold, and they did. And it got Clinton reelected.
Wow. That's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about 1971 to the present. You got a good quote from Jens O. Parsons here. We came now to the single most important law of inflation, the law of exponential inflation. We may also think of it as the law of geometric progression. Every inflation must compound itself at a geometrically increasing rate in order to continue to have the same beneficial effects as in the beginning. It means, in practical effect, that every inflation, once begun, must become continually worse.
That's true. I mean, I think I also, in one of the parts of the book, I spoke about how, it's like drinking or being a drug addict. You just have to keep taking a bigger and bigger dose to get the same high.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to go cold turkey on drinking or drugs or inflation.
Here you wrote that Lynn Alden makes the very interesting point that the drift away from sound money occurred almost naturally, driven by the development of technologies that provided and required faster settlement, thereby leapfrogging the need to physically settle transactions in gold. Her point is that modern technologies enabled credit structures leading to the inevitable death of sound money. It's kind of interesting. It
is interesting, and it's a good thesis. And I don't. She comes at it from an engineering point of view. I come at it from a political point of view.
Yeah,
and I agree that there are engineering things that occurred that led to not settling in gold and verifying gold and all that kind of stuff. However, I also believe that it was a political choice to abandon, sound money with the creation of the Fed and then the abandonment of the gold standard. And so it's twofold. We became a more ledger-based society, but again, back to the base layer, we could have ledgers all based on gold. I mean, They could be that could happen even though nobody's transacting in gold. You could, there's a company called Gold Money, run by Jim Turk, where you can pay people in gold.
Interesting.
Gold grams. I mean, if I have an account there and you have an account there, and we do a $20 transaction, I could submit, please send $20 from Larry, to Maddie, and my account will get. They'll look at the current gold price, figure out what 20. I'll lose a few grams, and your account will have a few grams. So you could be on a gold standard even with all this technology.
I think
it's not the technology that killed gold; it's the politics.
Yeah. Sadly, that's
right.
That's always a point of contention that they have the ability to do that, right? With gold, sadly,
Right.
they always get their fingers in there. And to close out this episode with a quote from your book: "It is dangerous to let politicians control something as important to societal well-being as money."
Correct.
And I think we'll stop there.
Perfect.